My sister sent me a care package with special tea bags she'd blended herself. She called the following day asking, "Did the tea help you relax?" I said warmly, "I haven't tried it, but I gave it to my pregnant neighbor. She's been so stressed lately." She started crying and said, "Oh my God, what have I done?" The phone line went silent except for my sister's ragged breathing. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the empty space on my counter where the gift box had been just hours earlier. My hand gripped the phone tighter as something cold settled in my stomach. The way she'd said those words, "Oh my God, what have I done?" wasn't the voice of someone who'd made a small mistake. It was the sound of absolute horror, the kind that comes from knowing you've set something terrible in motion and can't take it back. I asked her what she meant, trying to keep my voice steady, but she just kept crying, these awful choking sobs that made my chest tighten. When she finally spoke again, her words came out in fragments. She said I wasn't supposed to give those away. I was supposed to drink them myself. She'd made them special for me. The emphasis she put on the word special made my blood run cold. I'd been living in my apartment in Portland for 3 years when my sister Veronica sent the package. We'd grown up close, or at least I thought we had, 2 kids navigating our parents' messy divorce and the chaos that followed. She was 5 years older, always the protective one, always looking out for me. When I moved across the country for work, she'd seemed supportive, calling every few weeks, sending occasional care packages with homemade cookies or those organic energy bars she was always trying to get me to eat. This latest package had arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Inside the carefully wrapped box were a dozen small muslin bags, each tied with twine and labeled in her neat handwriting. Lavender chamomile blend, peppermint stress relief, ginger root clarity. The note inside said she'd been taking a herbalism course and wanted me to try her creations. She said I'd sounded stressed during our last call and thought these might help me relax after long days at the tech startup where I worked as a project manager. It seemed thoughtful, caring, exactly the kind of thing Veronica would do. My neighbor Melissa lived 2 doors down with her husband David. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a girl they'd already named Sophie. I'd known them since I moved into the building, the kind of friendly neighbors who'd water your plants when you traveled and accept your packages when you weren't home. Over the past few months, I'd watched Melissa grow more exhausted, more overwhelmed. Her pregnancy had been difficult. She'd mentioned complications, something about high blood pressure and mandatory bed rest, doctor's appointments 3 times a week. When I saw her in the hallway that Thursday evening, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and she moved slowly, one hand supporting her lower back. We chatted for a few minutes and she mentioned how stressed she'd been, how she couldn't sleep, how nothing seemed to help. That's when I remembered the tea. I told her I'd just received these handmade herbal blends from my sister and would she like to try some. Her face lit up with genuine gratitude. She said that sounded wonderful, that she'd been craving something warm and soothing but had to be so careful about what she consumed. I assured her they were all natural, made by my sister who was studying herbalism, completely safe. I gave her 4 of the bags, keeping the rest for myself. The next morning started normally. I was reviewing project timelines when Veronica called, her voice bright and cheerful in a way that immediately struck me as forced. She asked if I'd gotten her package, if I'd tried the tea yet, if it had helped me relax. I told her I'd been too busy but had given some to Melissa, describing how stressed and exhausted she looked, how grateful she'd been for the gift. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds, but felt like an hour. Then came that horrible choking sound, like she couldn't breathe. She asked me which neighbor, and I told her, the pregnant one down the hall. That's when the crying started, when those terrible words spilled out. Oh my God, what have I done? I demanded to know what was in the tea. She kept crying, kept saying she was sorry, she was so sorry, she never meant for anyone else to get hurt. The word hurt echoed in my ears. I raised my voice, told her she needed to tell me right now what was in those bags. She said she'd put things in them, things that weren't supposed to be safe for pregnant women, things that could cause problems. My hands started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I asked her exactly what she'd put in there, and she started listing ingredients, most of which meant nothing to me. Blue cohosh, pennyroyal oil, black cohosh, dong quai, high doses of vitamin C extract. She was speaking faster now, the words tumbling out between sobs. She said she'd researched them, found recipes online in forums about natural methods for ending early pregnancies, things women used before modern medicine. But she kept insisting they were meant for me, not for someone who was actually pregnant, not for someone in their 3rd trimester. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I asked her why the hell she would send me something like that. Her answer came in a whisper. She said she knew about the vasectomy I'd scheduled for next month, knew I'd decided I never wanted children, and she thought if there was even a chance I'd gotten someone pregnant without knowing, these teas would take care of it quietly. She'd convinced herself she was helping me, protecting me from a mistake that could ruin my life. The logic was insane, the kind of twisted reasoning that only makes sense inside someone's broken mind. I hung up on her and immediately called Melissa. The phone rang 6 times before David answered, his voice groggy with sleep since it was barely 8 in the morning on a Friday. I asked to speak to Melissa, and he said she was still sleeping, asked if it could wait. I told him no. It absolutely could not wait. I needed to talk to her right now about the tea I'd given her yesterday. Something in my tone must have alarmed him because he woke her immediately. When Melissa came on the line, I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked if she'd drunk any of the tea yet. She said yes, she'd had 2 cups last night before bed, and they'd helped her sleep better than she had in weeks. She sounded happy about it, grateful, which made what I had to say next feel like I was ripping her world apart. I told her she needed to go to the hospital immediately, that there might be dangerous herbs in the tea, things that weren't safe for pregnancy. The silence was different from my sister's, sharper somehow, filled with immediate terror. She asked me what I meant, and I explained as clearly as I could. My sister had sent the tea. It contained herbs that could potentially harm the baby. She needed medical attention right away. David grabbed the phone from her, and his voice turned cold and hard in a way I'd never heard before. He asked me what the hell I'd given his wife. I repeated everything, told him I was so sorry. I hadn't known. My sister had just told me. I could hear Melissa crying in the background, her sobs mixing with my sister's in my memory. David said they were leaving for the hospital right now, and if anything happened to their daughter, if anything happened to Melissa, he'd make sure I paid for it. The line went dead. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, trying to process what I'd just done. I'd poisoned my pregnant neighbor. It didn't matter that I hadn't known, didn't matter that my intentions had been good. I'd handed her something dangerous, and now a baby's life might be at risk because of me. My legs felt weak, and I had to sit down on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinet, trying to breathe through the panic rising in my chest. I called Veronica back and told her what was happening, that Melissa had drunk the tea, that they were going to the hospital. I demanded she send me everything, every ingredient, every website she'd used, everything she could remember about the blends. She said she'd email it all within the hour. I told her she needed to be prepared for the police to get involved, that if something happened to that baby, there would be consequences. She started crying harder, saying she never meant for this. She was trying to help me. She loved me. I asked her how sending me abortion herbs was helping when I'd literally never mentioned being in a relationship, much less having any pregnancy scares. Her explanation came out in broken fragments. She said she'd seen my social media posts with various women, assumed I was dating around, worried I wasn't being careful. She'd read articles about men being trapped by pregnancies, forced into fatherhood they didn't want, losing their freedom and futures. She thought she was giving me an insurance policy, a way out if I needed one. The disconnect between her perception and reality was staggering. I'd been on exactly 3 dates in the past year, all of which had gone nowhere. The women in my photos were co-workers, friends, my goddamn cousin visiting from California. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. I grabbed my keys and drove to the hospital, a 20-minute trip that I made in 12. The emergency room was crowded, but I found David in the waiting area, his face pale and drawn. When he saw me, he stood up fast, fists clenched at his sides. I raised my hands and told him I'd brought everything my sister had sent me, all the information about the ingredients. A security guard moved closer, clearly ready to intervene if things got physical. David stared at me for a long moment, then took the folder I'd printed out with all of Veronica's emails. He asked why I'd done this, and I told him the truth, all of it. How I'd thought they were just regular herbal teas, how my sister had intended them for me for some insane reason, how I'd never knowingly give anything harmful to Melissa. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. When I finished, he said the doctors were running tests, checking the baby's heart rate and Melissa's vitals, trying to determine what damage might have been done. He said Melissa was terrified, crying so hard they'd had to give her something to calm down, which was risky in itself, given her condition. A doctor came out about 30 minutes later, a woman in her mid-50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a bun. She introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Knowles, head of obstetrics, with 23 years of experience in high-risk pregnancies. She asked David if I was family, and he explained the situation in clipped, angry sentences. Dr. Knowles looked at me with an expression that managed to be both professional and deeply disappointed. She asked if I had the list of ingredients, and I handed her the printed sheets. She read through them, her frown deepening with each line. She said several of the herbs were known abortifacients, substances that could induce uterine contractions and potentially cause miscarriage or premature labor. In a pregnancy as advanced as Melissa's, the risks included placental abruption, fetal distress, and potentially stillbirth. The words hit me like physical blows. She said they were monitoring the baby closely and had Melissa on medications to counteract the effects, but the next 24 hours would be critical. She asked where I'd obtained these substances, and I explained about my sister, her herbalism course, her completely deranged reasoning. Dr. Knowles said she was legally obligated to report this to the authorities since it involved potential harm to a fetus. She asked if I would cooperate with an investigation, and I said absolutely, whatever they needed. She nodded and said a hospital social worker would be by to take my statement and collect the remaining tea bags as evidence. David stood there the whole time, staring at me like he was trying to decide whether to hit me or not. I told him again how sorry I was, that I'd do anything to help. He said the only thing I could do was make sure my sister faced consequences for this, that she didn't get away with nearly killing his daughter. I promised him I would. The social worker arrived within the hour, a thin man in his 30s who introduced himself as Kenneth Wright, licensed clinical social worker specializing in maternal and child welfare cases. He had me walk through the entire timeline, from receiving the package to giving Melissa the tea to discovering what was actually in it. He took photos of the remaining tea bags with a hospital camera, had me sign a statement confirming the chain of custody, and asked for my sister's contact information. I waited at the hospital for 6 hours. David eventually let me sit with him in the waiting room, though he didn't speak to me except to share updates when nurses came out. The baby's heart rate had dropped once, sending everyone into a panic, but stabilized after they adjusted Melissa's medications. They were keeping her for observation, possibly for several days, depending on how things progressed. Around 4 in the afternoon, 2 police officers arrived. The older one, a woman with short gray hair and tired eyes, introduced herself as Detective Linda Kowalski, 15 years with the Portland Police Department's Special Victims Unit. Her partner was Officer Raymond Chen, though he corrected her immediately, saying he went by Ray Chen at work, but his full name was Raymond Chow. I noticed the slight awkwardness in his correction and made a mental note. Detective Kowalski asked if I'd speak with them voluntarily, and I agreed without hesitation. We moved to a small consultation room where she recorded my statement on a digital recorder, having me repeat everything I'd told Kenneth Wright, this time with more questions about my sister's mental state, our relationship history, whether there had been any previous concerning behavior. I told them about how Veronica had become increasingly controlling over the years, how she'd sabotaged a relationship I'd had in college by telling my girlfriend I'd cheated when I hadn't, how she'd gotten angry when I'd moved to Portland because it put me too far away for her to visit regularly. I mentioned the vasectomy I'd scheduled and how violently she'd reacted when I'd told her about it 6 weeks ago, crying on the phone about how I was making a terrible mistake, how I'd regret it, how she'd always imagined being an aunt. At the time, I'd written it off as her being overly emotional, but now it felt like a piece of a larger pattern. Detective Kowalski asked if my sister had any history of mental illness or violence. I said not that I knew of, but clearly something was very wrong with her thinking. She asked if I'd be willing to participate in pressing charges if the district attorney decided to move forward. I said yes, without hesitation. She nodded and said they'd be in touch, that they needed to interview my sister and gather more evidence, but based on what I'd told them and the physical evidence of the tea bags, there was likely sufficient cause for criminal charges. That evening, I received a text from Veronica. It was long, rambling, full of apologies and justifications that contradicted each other. She said she loved me. She was only trying to protect me. She couldn't believe I'd given the tea away. How could I have been so careless? That last part enraged me more than anything else. She was somehow trying to make this my fault, as if I should have known her gift was actually a poison meant to end hypothetical pregnancies I wasn't even having. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the text to Detective Kowalski along with all of the previous messages Veronica had sent, including the ones where she'd talked about the vasectomy, where she'd expressed concern about my dating life, where she'd made comments about not letting women trap me. Seeing it all laid out like that, I realized just how obsessed she'd become with the idea of me having children or being forced into fatherhood. It was like she'd constructed an entire alternate reality in her mind, where I was constantly at risk of pregnancy entrapment, and she was the only one standing between me and disaster. The hospital kept Melissa for 5 days. I visited every day, though I only made it past the waiting room twice. David's parents came into town and made it very clear they wanted nothing to do with me, which I understood completely. The second time I was allowed in, Melissa was awake and looked exhausted but stable. She asked me why my sister would do something like this, and I told her everything I knew, which still didn't feel like enough of an explanation. She said the doctors had told her the baby seemed to be okay, that the medications had worked, but they were still concerned about premature labor and would be monitoring her closely until delivery. She said she'd probably have nightmares about this for the rest of her life, about how close she'd come to losing Sophie because she'd drunk some tea a neighbor had given her in kindness. I told her I'd never forgive myself, and she said she was trying not to hate me because she knew I hadn't known, but it was hard. She asked me to leave after that, and I did. Detective Kowalski called me on a Wednesday evening, 9 days after the initial incident. She said the DA had reviewed the case and was filing charges against Veronica for reckless endangerment, assault, and attempted poisoning. The attempted poisoning charge was specific to Oregon law, covering situations where someone administered substances to another person with intent to cause physical harm, even if the harm was ultimately unsuccessful. She said my sister had been arrested that morning in New Jersey where she lived and was fighting extradition to Oregon. Her lawyer was arguing that she'd never intended for Melissa to consume the tea, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that she'd simply been trying to give her brother what she thought was a helpful gift. The DA's office wasn't buying it. They had the text messages, the ingredient lists from websites specifically discussing abortion herbs, and Veronica's own admission that she'd knowingly included substances dangerous to pregnancy in the blends. Detective Kowalski asked if I'd be willing to testify, and I said absolutely. Melissa went into labor 3 weeks early, on a Monday afternoon. David called me from the hospital to tell me Sophie had been born, 6 pounds 3 ounces, healthy, despite everything. He said I should know that the baby was okay, that despite what my sister had done, Sophie had survived. He didn't sound grateful, just tired and relieved that his daughter was alive. He said Melissa didn't want to see me or hear from me again, that they'd be moving to a different apartment complex as soon as she was recovered enough to pack. I told him I understood and congratulated him on his daughter's birth. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment and cried for the first time since this whole nightmare had started. Relief that the baby was okay. Anger at my sister for putting everyone through this. Shame that I'd been the vehicle for her poison, even unknowingly. Veronica eventually stopped fighting extradition. Her lawyer had convinced her that cooperating might help with sentencing. She arrived in Portland in custody on a Thursday, 2 months after the initial incident. I attended her arraignment, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching her stand before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, looking small and broken. She pled not guilty, and her lawyer argued for bail, saying she wasn't a flight risk and had no prior criminal record. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named District Attorney Rachel Montgomery, with 12 years of experience in violent crimes, argued that Veronica had deliberately created dangerous substances with the intent to cause harm, that the fact the wrong person had consumed them was irrelevant to her criminal intent, and that she posed a continued danger given her obsessive behavior regarding her brother's reproductive choices. The judge set bail at $100,000, which Veronica's lawyer said she couldn't afford. She was remanded to custody pending trial. I received a letter from her a week later. The jail allowed inmates to send mail, and she'd used her allocation to write me a 6-page letter that swung wildly between apology and accusation. She wrote that she was sorry for what had happened to Melissa and the baby, but I needed to understand she'd only been trying to help me, to give me options and freedom. She said our mother had gotten pregnant with her to trap our father into marriage, and it had ruined his life, turned him bitter and angry, and she couldn't bear to see the same thing happen to me. She wrote that when I'd told her about the vasectomy, she'd panicked, thinking I was closing off my options forever, and the tea had been her way of giving me a safety net before I made that permanent choice. The letter revealed a level of paranoia and delusion I'd never suspected. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that I'd never needed or wanted her intervention, that her entire premise was based on fears that existed only in her mind. The trial was set for 4 months later. In the meantime, I had to deal with the aftermath in my own life. My landlord asked me to move out, saying the other tenants were uncomfortable with the situation and worried about safety. I found a new apartment across town and left without argument. My job became strained because I'd had to take so much time off for legal proceedings and meetings with the DA's office. My manager was sympathetic but firm about the impact on project timelines. I ended up taking a leave of absence to focus on getting through the trial. I started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Julia Hartman, who specialized in family trauma. She helped me process the betrayal, the guilt, the complicated mix of emotions around my sister. She pointed out that Veronica had violated my autonomy just as much as she'd endangered Melissa, that her obsession with controlling my reproductive future was deeply disturbing regardless of the pregnancy angle. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but she was right. Even if Melissa had never been involved, what Veronica had done was a violation of my choices and my body. The trial lasted 8 days. The prosecution called me as their first witness, and I spent 4 hours on the stand, walking through everything from my relationship with Veronica to the moment I realized what I'd given to Melissa. Veronica's defense attorney, a slick man in expensive suits named Thomas Whitmore, tried to paint me as negligent, arguing that I should have asked more questions about the tea before giving it away. The prosecutor objected, and the judge sustained it, but the seed was planted. I knew some of the jury was looking at me with judgment. Melissa testified on the 4th day, 8 months after giving birth, and described the terror of being told she'd consumed something that could kill her baby, the days of fear in the hospital, the ongoing anxiety she felt even now that Sophie was healthy. She broke down crying twice, and the jury looked stricken. David testified about the emotional toll, the nightmares Melissa still had, the way they couldn't trust neighbors or casual kindness anymore. Dr. Knowles testified about the medical specifics, the dangers of the herbs, how close they'd come to losing the baby. The prosecution brought in an expert witness, Dr. Amanda Fletcher, a toxicologist with a specialty in herbal substances and poisoning cases. She'd worked with the FBI for 15 years before moving to academic research. She walked the jury through each ingredient Veronica had included, explaining the dosages and combinations, the specific effects on pregnancy. She testified that the concentrations in the tea bags were significant, that they'd clearly been prepared with intent to affect pregnancy rather than as accidental contamination or casual herbal blending. She said the research Veronica had cited in her emails came from fringe websites known for promoting dangerous, unproven methods, and that anyone doing actual herbalism training through legitimate programs would have known these substances were dangerous and never would have combined them this way. It was damning testimony that destroyed the defense's argument that this was simply an unfortunate accident born of ignorance. Veronica took the stand in her own defense, and it was painful to watch. Her lawyer had clearly coached her, but she couldn't maintain the script. She started out apologizing to Melissa and David, saying she never meant for any of this to happen. But when the prosecutor cross-examined her, asking about her stated intent in the emails she'd sent me, she became defensive. She said she'd been trying to protect me, that she'd seen too many men's lives destroyed by unplanned pregnancies, that she'd only wanted to give me options. Dia Montgomery asked her if she'd consulted with me before creating these options, and she said no, she'd wanted it to be a surprise, a gift. The prosecutor asked if she understood that the substances she'd included could end a pregnancy, and she said yes, that was the point, but only if there was a pregnancy to end. Montgomery asked if she'd verified whether I was actually at risk of any pregnancy before sending the tea, and Veronica admitted she hadn't. She'd just assumed based on my social life and dating patterns. The prosecutor asked her to describe my dating patterns, and Veronica faltered, finally admitting she didn't actually know much about my personal life, just what she'd seen on social media. Montgomery pulled up the photos Veronica had referenced, showing them to the jury, images of me at work events, family gatherings, casual dinners with friends. She asked Veronica to point out which of these indicated active romantic or sexual relationships. Veronica couldn't. The closing arguments were brutal. The defense tried to argue that Veronica had acted out of misguided love, that she genuinely believed she was helping me, that the tragic outcome was the result of my negligence in giving away a gift meant for me personally. The prosecution countered that intent to harm didn't require the harm to land on the intended target, that Veronica had created a dangerous substance knowing its effects, had sent it through the mail with clear intent that it be consumed, and that the fact I'd given it to someone else didn't absolve her of responsibility for creating the danger in the first place. D.A. Montgomery reminded the jury of Sophie, a baby who'd nearly died before she was born because a woman she'd never met had decided her brother's hypothetical reproductive freedom was more important than basic safety. She said this wasn't love, it was obsession and control disguised as care, and it had nearly killed an innocent child. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I sat in the courthouse waiting room, unable to eat or focus on anything else. When they came back, I was called in to hear the verdict. The forewoman stood and read the counts. Guilty on reckless endangerment, guilty on assault, guilty on attempted poisoning. Veronica's face crumpled and she started crying, her lawyer's hand on her shoulder as the judge pulled the jury to confirm the verdict. Sentencing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. I walked out of the courthouse into bright sunshine that felt wrong somehow, like the world should be darker to match the occasion. I'd just watched my sister get convicted of trying to poison me and nearly killing a baby in the process. There was no satisfaction in it, just a hollow, exhausted relief that it was over. Sentencing day came on a Friday morning in late autumn. The judge, a stern woman named Justice Caroline Stevens with 30 years on the bench, listened to both sides present their arguments. The defense begged for leniency, painted Veronica as a troubled woman who needed mental health treatment more than prison. The prosecution countered that Veronica had shown no real remorse, that her testimony had revealed a continued belief that she'd been right to do what she did, and that she posed a genuine danger if released. Melissa and David were allowed to give victim impact statements. Melissa spoke about the nightmares, the therapy, the way she couldn't look at her daughter sometimes without remembering how close she'd come to losing her. David talked about the violation of trust, how they'd had to move apartments, change their daily routines, how his wife still flinched when neighbors offered kindness. I was allowed to speak too. I told the judge about the betrayal, how my sister had violated my autonomy and my trust, how she'd poisoned a relationship with caring neighbors, how I'd never feel safe accepting gifts from family again. I said I loved my sister, but I couldn't let that love excuse what she'd done or minimize the harm she'd caused. Justice Stevens sentenced Veronica to 8 years in state prison with mandatory psychiatric evaluation and treatment. She cited the premeditated nature of the crime, the use of specialized knowledge to create dangerous substances, and the lack of genuine remorse. She said Veronica's obsession with controlling her brother's reproductive choices demonstrated a fundamental disrespect for personal autonomy that had nearly resulted in the death of an infant. She noted that while the court had sympathy for mental health struggles, those struggles did not excuse criminal behavior, especially when the defendant showed no real understanding of why her actions were wrong. Veronica was led away crying, glancing back at me once with an expression I couldn't read, something between betrayal and sorrow. I didn't look away. I wanted her to see that I was there, that I'd stood witness to the consequences of her actions. That love didn't mean enabling or protecting someone from accountability. The appeals process took another year. Veronica's new lawyer argued that the sentence was excessive, that her mental state at the time should have been considered more seriously, that she'd been acting under delusions about protecting family. The appeals court upheld the conviction and sentence, finding that the trial had been conducted fairly and the sentence was within appropriate guidelines for the crimes committed. I received notification of the decision by mail and filed it away without much emotion. I'd moved on as much as I could. I'd returned to work, found a new apartment in a different neighborhood, rebuilt my routines. I still saw the therapist monthly, working through the complex feelings about family and trust and the ways we fail each other. Sophie turned 2 last month. I know this because I saw David post about it on a neighborhood social media group, a cheerful message about a birthday party and gratitude for healthy children. I didn't comment or react, just looked at the photo of a smiling toddler with dark curls and thought about how different things could have been. I think about Melissa sometimes, wonder if she still has nightmares, if she's managed to rebuild her sense of safety in the world. I hope she has. I hope Sophie grows up never knowing how close she came to not existing, though I suspect her parents will tell her someday, when she's old enough to understand. I hope she knows that sometimes the worst dangers come dressed as kindness, and that trust has to be earned and verified, not assumed. I visited Veronica once, 6 months into her sentence. The prison visiting room was stark and sad, filled with the quiet conversations of people trying to maintain connections across barriers. She looked smaller, grayer, older than her years. We talked for 30 minutes about nothing important: the weather, the food, her prison job in the library. Neither of us mentioned the trial or what had brought her there. When I stood to leave, she asked if I'd forgiven her, and I told her the truth. I said I didn't know if I ever would, that forgiveness felt like too simple a word for something this complicated, but that I hoped she was getting the help she needed, and maybe someday she'd understand why what she'd done was so profoundly wrong. She nodded and said she was trying, that the therapy was hard but necessary, that she was beginning to see how distorted her thinking had been. I said that was good, and left without looking back. I never rescheduled the vasectomy. Not because of anything Veronica did or said, but because the whole experience made me reconsider how I make permanent decisions about my body and future. I might still get it someday, or I might not. But either way, it'll be my choice made for my reasons, not as a reaction to someone else's fear or control. I date occasionally now, carefully, with better boundaries than I had before. I'm honest about what I want and don't want, and I don't assume good intentions just because someone claims to love me. Love without respect for autonomy isn't love at all. It's possession dressed up in prettier language, and I'm done accepting that from anyone. The tea bags that I'd kept for myself were destroyed as evidence after the trial concluded. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd drunk them instead of giving them to Melissa, if Veronica's plan had actually worked the way she'd intended. The herbs wouldn't have ended any pregnancy because there wasn't one to end, but they still could have made me sick, still could have caused damage to my body without my knowledge or consent. That violation is just as real even though it didn't happen. My sister tried to poison me with the excuse that she was protecting me, and the fact that someone else got hurt instead doesn't erase her intent or make her actions less monstrous. I still think about that phone call sometimes, the way her voice broke when she realized what I'd done with her gift. Oh my God, what have I done? In that moment, she'd understood the magnitude of her actions, seen them clearly without the distortion of her obsessive protective delusions. For those few seconds, she'd grasped the reality that her attempt to control my life had nearly killed an innocent baby. But understanding in a moment of crisis isn't the same as genuine change or remorse, and her behavior afterward proved that. She'd spent more time trying to justify her actions than truly grappling with why they were wrong, more energy on defending her intentions than acknowledging the harm she'd caused. Justice came in the form of a courtroom verdict and a prison sentence, but it didn't erase what happened or undo the trauma. Melissa and David still carry the scars. Sophie exists, healthy and loved, but her parents had to fight for that in ways they never should have. I carry my own scars, the knowledge that someone I loved and trusted was willing to violate my body and autonomy because her fear overrode her respect for my choices. These are the costs of Veronica's delusions, tallied up in therapy sessions and sleepless nights and relationships that can never be repaired. The tea was meant to give me freedom from hypothetical consequences, but all it did was destroy the freedom we all had to trust in simple kindness, to accept gifts without fear, to believe our loved ones have our best interests at heart. That's the real poison she created, and no amount of prison time can ever truly remedy that loss. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.